Well, hello to everyone watching, wherever you may be. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia and the Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. This is the latest virtual public event that the Wilson Center has produced since we shifted to remote operations several months ago. These events require a whole lot of time and effort from the Wilson Center's very efficient but very busy multimedia team. So I want to thank John Tyler and his team with the Wilson Center multimedia staff. And I also want to thank the Wilson Center's Middle East program, the institutional co-sponsor for this event. The focus of our discussion today is on the potential economic impacts of COVID-19 in South Asia. Every day for many weeks, we have all been thinking about and worrying about the coronavirus pandemic. One of the reasons why it's so worrisome, obviously aside from its deadliness and infectiousness, is that there is so much that we don't know. We don't know when there will be a vaccine. We don't know how long COVID-19 will be with us. We don't know if and when there will be new waves of the pandemic later this year. But if there's one thing about the pandemic that we can say with something close to certainty, it is that there will be real and lasting and deleterious economic impacts, at least in the short term. And Asia is a particular region of concern. Earlier this month, my Wilson Center colleague, Shihoko Goto, hosted a virtual event with Yasuyuki Sawada, the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank, and he projected that growth in developing Asia will fall from 5.2% last year to 2.2% this year. Many experts also expect South Asia to take a significant hit. One of the gloomiest predictions comes from the World Bank, which forecasts the worst economic performance in the region in 40 years. And broadly speaking, South Asia experiences significant levels of poverty, as well as infrastructural and connectivity constraints. So the economic vulnerability of South Asia in the face of the pandemic is plain to see. And there's been much commentary, for good reason, about the economic impacts of COVID on the US, on China, on Europe, among other places. But discussion about the impacts in South Asia is important too, given that this region hosts more than 20% of the world's population and nearly 20% of global economic growth. And the region is highly consequential for US interests. It is home to a key US partner in the US Indo-Pacific strategy. It is home to a terrible, unending US-led war. And it's also a key theater for investments and other types of activities by China, of course, America's top strategic rival. So we're very fortunate to have with us today a terrific panel that will weigh in on potential short and longer term impacts of the coronavirus pandemic in South Asia. And we wanted to take advantage of the technology that we have at our disposal in these extraordinary times to take this discussion about South Asia to South Asia instead of just counting on experts based here in the US. So accordingly, our panelists are all senior economists in 4 different countries in the region, and each of them will discuss potential economic impacts of the pandemic in their respective countries, which are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And these are, of course, countries with varying economic conditions and realities, to put it mildly. So I'll introduce the panelists, but very briefly, as you should all be able to see their bios on your screen if you scroll down a bit. So first, we'll be hearing from Dr. Azam Chaudhry, who is Professor of Economics and Dean of the Faculty of Economics at the Lahore School of Economics in Lahore, Pakistan. He teaches undergraduate and graduate econometrics and macroeconomics. We will then have 2 co-presenters in Afghanistan. The first one is Dr. Omar Joya. He's an economist and head of research at the Biruni Institute, an economic policy research organization in Kabul, Afghanistan. He is also a visiting research fellow at Oxford and an affiliated researcher with the University of Bordeaux's research unit. Our second co-presenter from Afghanistan is Nazir Kabiri, who is executive director of the Biruni Institute. Previously, he was a senior policy advisor to Afghanistan's finance ministry. We will also be hearing from Dr. Ahsan Mansoor, who is founding and executive director of the Policy Research Institute in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Previously, he had a long career at the International Monetary Fund that entailed work on countries in Asia, but also Africa, Central America, and the Middle East. And finally, we have with us Dr. Ila Patnaik, who is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, India. Previously, she was the principal economic advisor to the government of India. She has also held posts at the National Council of Applied Economic Research and the Indian Council for Research and International Economic Relations, and she was previously an economics editor at the Indian Express newspaper. So the format will be brief opening comments from each of our panelists. I may then ask a few questions, and then we'll go to a Q&A with questions from Twitter and email. So for all of you watching right now, please, if you have a question, please tweet it to the Wilson Center's Asia Program Twitter handle, which is @AsiaProgram, all one word, or you can email your question to asia@wilsoncenter.org. So with that, no one tuned in to listen to me talk. We want to hear from the experts, so I will stop there. And so now let's go to Kabul, where we'll hear from our co-presenters, Dr. Joya and Mr. Kabiri. I'm not sure which one of you would like to go first, but the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for inviting us. We're very glad to attend this webinar hosted by Wilson Center. I'll speak first. I'm Omar Joya. I'll speak first, and then my colleague Nazir Kabiri will speak about the regional dimensions of the pandemic. But my talk will be mostly concentrated on the economic aspects of the current crisis. But let me first give a very brief context to those who are unfamiliar with the Afghan economy or who have not been following some recent political and economic developments in the country. Currently, we are going through three simultaneous crises. First being conflict and security. We are in the midst of conflict. Just this week, there were 3 to 4 attacks, one on a hospital, and there were several civilians that were killed, especially women and newborn babies, actually. Second, we are in the midst of a political crisis. There have been dispute over election results, and the dispute is still ongoing, and the two claimants of the elections have not reached any political resolution so far. And the third is the economic crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. So far in Afghanistan, the impact of the COVID-19 has been relatively limited and muted for some reasons. There have been so far around 6,000 cases, confirmed cases only, but this number could be strongly underreported because of under-testing and so many other reasons. I think Afghanistan in South Asia, it sort of stands alone. And that's because of 3 to 4 structural characteristics of the economy, which you don't see in other South Asian economies. So the first being a high dependence on aid. Around 60% of our budget is financed by donor grants. But apart from the government budget, there are huge off-budget expenditures in the country which are directly supported by the donors. So if we take into account those off-budget expenditures, in addition to the government budget, then we see that 75% of public spending in the country is financed by donor grants. So that's the first distinct feature that I'm highlighting. The second is that here in Afghanistan, the government does not have access to alternative financing sources. Unlike other countries, which could actually tap into domestic financial markets where there are some opportunities for borrowing, or they could actually perhaps borrow globally. The Afghan government cannot borrow domestically. So there are no domestic financing, alternative financing sources available at all. So these two, high dependence on aid and lack of alternative financing sources means that there's no fiscal space for the government to actually use any sort of fiscal expansionary policy if it would want to in response to the current economic crisis. And the fact that it cannot find any alternative financing sources when domestic revenues are declining as a result of economic recession. The third distinct feature of the Afghan economy is a high dependence on imported food. We are not self-sufficient in the very basic food staples. We import almost all of our food products from abroad, including wheat. We import almost all of our wheat requirements from Kazakhstan and then from Pakistan. And also we import rice from India and Pakistan. So risks to food security in Afghanistan is actually quite high. And I think this is unmatched in the region. Now, with this said, let me give a very brief economic outlook. So we went out with our economic outlook report in early April, and we developed two scenarios using a macroeconomic model that we have developed. So in a moderate scenario where the COVID-19 pandemic would be sort of contained by summer, let's say, and that disruptions to trade will be only temporarily. In that case, we expect an economic contraction of 3.3%, similar to what Dr. Chaudhry mentioned about their forecast for the Pakistan's economy. So in a moderate scenario, we expect a 3% economic contraction this year. But if the pandemic worsens and if we experience a much persistent disruptions to trade and international movement of goods, then in that case, the economic contraction could be as large as 10% this year. On domestic revenues, we expect that revenues would decline quite substantially in Afghanistan. Even in the first 4 months of the fiscal year, domestic revenues were down by 25% compared to the first 4 months of the previous year. So Afghanistan will be facing a full-fledged fiscal crisis this year, unfortunately. And then the third, because of high dependence on imported food, we expect a rising inflation in the country, with inflation could go as high as 25%, with food prices jumping to around 40 to 45% this year in a severe scenario for COVID-19. And that's very similar to what we experienced during the 2007 and 2008 global food prices crisis. And then finally, I think the distributional impacts of the economic recession would be very severe in Afghanistan. Poverty rate was already very high at 55%. Now, if the economy experiences a recession of anywhere between 3 to 10%, then in that case, we expect an additional 8 million people to fall below the poverty line, pushing the poverty rate from the current rate of 55% up to 80%. So I think the implications of the COVID-19, the economic implications of it on the Afghan economy would be much, much devastating than many other economies in South Asia, given the high vulnerabilities that we have in the region.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I will use the remaining amount of time to perhaps share some perspective on the regional dynamics of this pandemic. Our understanding is that poverty in the region will worsen the pandemic. Millions of daily wagers cannot observe lockdown for too long, as it has already been the case in Afghanistan. Second, AFPAC trade remains very limited at the moment due to the new restrictions imposed at the borders. Thousands of Afghanistan containers stranded in Pakistan. Afghanistan at the moment cannot export to Pakistan. The third is, as far as South Asia is concerned, and Afghanistan being in the Western sub-region in South Asia, for us, South Asia doesn't move forward beyond Pakistan due to the historical rivalries between India and Pakistan. Fourth, our understanding is that the chances that COVID-19 pandemic going to unlock the full potential for regional cooperation remains very low. The political dynamics of the situation in the region is as such that full and durable regional cooperation is not applicable in foreseeable future. Political rivalry in the region is very deep-rooted. COVID-19 will not encourage regionalism as we just see the current trends. It will further encourage nationalistic and inward policies. COVID-19 is not going to change any geopolitical fault lines in South Asia. And sixth, if the virus gets out of control in Afghanistan, so will the country. Failure in Afghanistan will have serious implications on the region. And really quickly, in terms of some recommendations, we suggest a joint research program, a joint regional research program for perhaps for the development of a vaccine, as India are already taking the lead on that. The Prime Minister Modi perhaps announced a program that they could start soon. The second is, I think it's very important to keep the borders open with Afghanistan to let the trade flow. And that has to do a lot with the food security. And the third is that the situation in Afghanistan requires a collective attention by all of us. Fighting Corona and post-Corona recovery in Afghanistan calls upon all of us in this region to collaborate and assist as much as possible. To start with, let's put our regional differences aside when it comes to the Afghan peace process. This is immediate. A peaceful Afghanistan is in the best interest of all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both Dr. Joya and Mr. Kabiri for a very interesting, troubling and depressing presentation, though I think also very, very realistic. So thank you for that. Let's now go to Kabul and hear from our Afghan panelists on the question of what cuts in international assistance because of COVID could mean for Afghanistan, a country which, as you mentioned before, is heavily dependent on international assistance.
Yes, that's correct. Afghanistan has been a special case last 20 years, and we are thankful to the very generous support by the international community. But the country now is in a very critical juncture, especially with all these four simultaneous challenges mentioned by Dr. Joya. The political, the economy, the conflict, as well as the immigrants will have a huge fallout on the region. A failure in Afghanistan will have serious national security implications for all of us in the world. I think with the security expenditure already declining for most of our NATO and American counterparts, I think there is a chance that we can transfer some to the civilian bill. And provided that the country is going through a peace process, I think that is further going to decline the cost of war. So this way, I think we can, in a sense, make some savings. And at the same time, there's going to be a Geneva conference on the Afghan economy later this year. And we are hoping that the international community continue with some further pledges to help us pass through this very critical juncture. I think it's a case worth investing for a little further until this peace process is succeeded.
Thanks. Our speakers in Kabul.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the policy advice, yet we haven't seen an economic policy from the government side. We encourage the government to come up with a Corona action plan, a national policy to fight the pandemic. That is still to be seen. Second is a social transfer to the needy, to the poor. It's the poor that cannot observe the lockdown for too long, and that will further exacerbate the situation. As it was already said, we are just postponing the crisis, but the poor doesn't have the luxury for too long to stay at home. I believe the soonest that people get out, and that's going to be any day soon, the situation will further deteriorate. So a social transfer program, be it in kind or in cash, is an urgent need in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patnaik. I appreciate that. This has been a terrific discussion. We do have to wrap up. I really want to thank our panelists who took time out of their busy days and nights, really. Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you to our audience for your great questions and for listening in. For those of you that may have joined late and didn't see everything, we will have the video of this broadcast posted on the Wilson Center's website within the next day or so. So please, everyone, stay well and stay safe, and above all else, stay healthy. And thank you once again. We are now adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.